It was a crisp October evening, the kind where the air bites at your cheeks and the sky hangs dark. And still over the quiet town of Willow Creek. 17-year-old Mia and her boyfriend, 18-year-old Jason, had been looking forward to this night for weeks. Their small group of friends had gathered at a secluded lakeside clearing where a bonfire burned bright against the encroaching darkness, sending sparks into the chilly autumn air. Laughter echoed across the water as the teens joked, teased, and swapped stories that felt important in that moment, as if the world outside the circle of fire could never touch them. The leaves underfoot crunched with every step, the smell of smoke mingling with damp earth, and everything seemed ordinary, even comforting. They were just kids caught between the careless abandon of youth and the quiet pull of adult fears, and for a few hours, none of that mattered. As the night deepened, the crowd around the fire began to thin. Some wandered to their cars, others slipped into tents or huddled under blankets. Mia and Jason, however, lingered at the water's edge, their hands brushing together, murmuring plans for the weekend, for college, for the summer they'd never forget. The world seemed small and intimate, a private pocket carved out of the forest. Then, quietly, almost imperceptibly, they stepped away from the warmth of the fire, moving along the forested shoreline. No one noticed at first, wrapped as they were in their own conversations and the hypnotic pull of the flames. The forest embraced them, dark and silent, except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant lap of water against the shore. Friends later recalled seeing them disappear behind a copse of trees, the last glimmer of their flashlights swallowed by the shadows. It was a short walk, they thought, a harmless adventure before returning to the circle of friends. But what should have been a few minutes stretched into hours. At first, nobody worried. Teenagers sometimes wandered, they assumed, lost in the moment or chasing private conversations. Then, the murmurs of concern began to ripple through the group. A flashlight beam swept the tree line, and calls to Mia and Jason went unanswered. Panic set in as minutes became an hour. Friends scattered along the shore, their voices trembling as they shouted for them, their calls bouncing off the trees, answered only by the soft sighing of wind through the branches. Somewhere in the distance, faint, indistinct noises were heard, what some described as shouting, or perhaps a scream, but nothing concrete emerged from the dark. There were no answers, only an oppressive silence that seemed to stretch with deliberate cruelty over the lake. A nearby parent, who had been driving home when the first texts arrived, returned immediately, the urgency in their movements betraying the growing fear. By midnight, authorities were called, and the reality set in. 2 teenagers were missing. Volunteers gathered, flashlights cutting swaths of light through the forest. K-9 units sniffed the cold ground, ears pricked, tails stiff, following scents that had begun to fade with the autumn chill. The first sweep revealed only fragments, a lone sneaker half buried in fallen leaves, a backpack abandoned on the sand, and a blanket that bore the faint smell of smoke, but no human scent. Nothing indicated struggle, and yet nothing suggested that Mia and Jason had simply wandered off and disappeared. The searchers felt an unease that went beyond natural fear, the kind that settles into your chest when logic offers no comfort. Witnesses recalled small, inexplicable details, the way a sudden gust of wind seemed to extinguish parts of the fire, or how distant reflections shimmered across the water as if someone, or something, was moving just beyond perception. Friends were questioned repeatedly, their stories checked and cross-checked, yet each account contradicted another in minor ways. Who last saw them, who called out first, what noises were heard. It was a puzzle built not of evidence, but of uncertainty. That night, the forest, once a backdrop to laughter and whispered secrets, became an unyielding maze of shadows and questions, swallowing 2 lives without a trace. By dawn, the search had intensified. Helicopters hovered above the treetops, their spotlights cutting through the mist rising from the lake. Families arrived, faces pale and drawn, clutching each other, holding on to hope that was already fraying at the edges. Investigators combed every possible exit point from the shoreline, questioning passing hikers, joggers, and even local residents who might have seen the teens in transit. But the trail went cold almost immediately. Footprints ended abruptly near dense undergrowth. No tire tracks, no discarded evidence, nothing to suggest direction or destination. Every hour of silence weighed heavier than the last, pressing into the hearts of everyone involved. By the evening, the first theories emerged. Perhaps they had fallen into the water, maybe they had run into someone dangerous, or perhaps they were simply lost, hiding, waiting to be found. But no evidence supported any of these possibilities conclusively. And as darkness returned to the forest, swallowing both shore and trail, the reality became undeniable. Mia and Jason were gone, vanished into a night that seemed impossibly long, leaving behind only whispers, fear, and the lingering scent of smoke. Their disappearance was no longer a temporary worry. It was a mystery, and one that would grow heavier with every passing hour. Within minutes of realizing Mia and Jason had not returned, their friends' initial worry turned into urgent action. Phones were out, fingers trembling as frantic calls were made to parents, neighbors, and ultimately, the local authorities. By the time police arrived, the forested shore of Willow Creek had grown eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and the lapping of water against the sand. Volunteers began to assemble, flashlights in hand, ready to comb the shoreline and the dark looming forest beyond. The scale of the search quickly expanded as K-9 units were called in, their noses trained to follow scents even as the autumn chill began to mask every trace. Officers divided into grids, moving deliberately, checking every hollow and underbrush patch where a teenager might hide, or where something worse might have happened. The first sweep revealed fragments of the teens last night. On the sandy shore, a single sneaker lay half-buried beneath fallen leaves, its laces frayed, as though it had been kicked off in haste. Nearby, a backpack sat open, its contents minimal: a notebook, a cell phone, and a water bottle. A partially burned blanket, charred at one corner, suggested the couple had left the warmth of the fire without it, but forensic teams could detect no traces of smoke inhalation, no chemical residue beyond the ash. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no indication that they had been attacked at that exact location. Yet the discovery of these scattered belongings offered only more questions than answers. How could two teenagers vanish so completely, leaving behind the tools that should have anchored them in reality? As the search intensified, authorities began to catalog subtle, unsettling anomalies. Footprints led to the tree line, but abruptly ended, as if the earth had swallowed the weight of their passage. K-9 units reacted to faint scents that twisted through the woods, only to lose the trail shortly after it began. Every officer and volunteer felt the same tension, the weight of a night that refused to yield clarity. Families hovered on the periphery, clutching jackets, blankets, anything to hold themselves together while the forest seemed to swallow certainty. Each rustle, each unexplained shadow, became amplified in the minds of those searching, feeding an unspoken fear that this was not merely a case of teenagers wandering too far. Investigators worked methodically, interviewing friends multiple times to verify the timeline. Witness statements were carefully cross-referenced. Some friends reported hearing faint voices calling from the woods, but no one could identify whether it had been Mia or Jason, or perhaps nothing at all. Some recalled strange lights flickering in the distance, beyond the bonfire's reach, but again, nothing could be confirmed. The police maintained a professional distance, documenting everything, yet privately, many worried that the forest held more than simple misadventure. It held secrets, and those secrets had swallowed the teens whole. The search extended through the night and into the following day. Canoes scoured the lake's edge, volunteers formed long lines through the underbrush, and divers checked shallow areas near the shore. Despite every effort, the only items recovered remained the same: the backpack, the sneaker, and the blanket. Nothing else. The emptiness grew heavier as time passed, and with each hour, the initial hope that they had simply gotten lost began to fade. Grief seeped into the air, and a silence settled over the clearing, heavier than the absence of the teens themselves. For the families, the waiting was unbearable. Parents took shifts sitting near the edge of the search grid, eyes scanning the tree line, imagining every possible scenario. Friends who had been at the bonfire replayed every detail repeatedly, asking themselves if there had been a warning they missed, a sign overlooked. Sleep became impossible. Every unexpected sound, the snap of a branch, the cry of a distant bird, felt like a message from the forest. Meanwhile, the investigators meticulously logged each piece of evidence, knowing that even small details might be the key to unraveling what had truly happened that night. By evening, the scale of the effort was staggering. Over 50 volunteers had combed the area, police officers had mapped the shoreline and forest grids, and yet the teens themselves were nowhere to be found. The evidence suggested they had left the fire, but where they went after that, and why, remained an unanswerable question. Shadows deepened among the trees, the lake reflected nothing but the waning light, and a cold sense of foreboding settled into every corner of the clearing. For everyone involved, the search had shifted from finding two teenagers to confronting a gnawing, terrifying uncertainty that perhaps something else, something deliberate, was at play, and that the truth might be far darker than anyone wanted to imagine. The first night of the search ended with volunteers exhausted, families hollow-eyed and silent, and police officers reviewing the scant evidence over and over, looking for patterns where there seemed to be none. The lake was still, the forest dense, and the air carried a tense quiet that pressed against the chest. In that silence, every possibility felt worse than the last, and a new question began to take hold in the minds of those who refused to leave. If Mia and Jason were not hiding, if they had not simply wandered into the night, then where had they gone? And who, or what, had taken them from the only place they had ever felt safe that evening? In the days following the disappearance, law enforcement worked tirelessly to catalog every detail, every possible clue, no matter how small. Officers returned repeatedly to the lakeshore and surrounding forest, photographing footprints, marking tree trunks, and measuring distances between discovered items. The backpack, recovered near the water's edge, was examined thoroughly by forensic teams. It contained nothing incriminating, no drugs, no weapons, no signs of theft or struggle. Its contents, a notebook, a water bottle, and a cell phone, offered only fragments of the teenagers' last hours. But near the same shoreline, investigators discovered something that immediately drew concern: a series of shallow drag marks imprinted in the dirt and leaf litter. The marks began near where the blanket had been found and led into the thicker underbrush, disappearing as abruptly as they started. For trained eyes, the pattern suggested that a person, or something, had been moved, carried, or had fallen in a manner that could not be explained by an accident or misstep. Cell phone records provided the next piece of the puzzle. The devices placed Mia and Jason in the forested area near the lake until approximately 11:45 p.m., after which the signals abruptly ceased. Investigators scoured cell towers, triangulated positions, and examined call logs for any indication of contact with other people, but there was nothing. The last messages were innocuous, typical conversations with friends expressing plans to return to the bonfire. Beyond that, silence. It was as though the forest had claimed them in a way that left no trace, no digital or physical footprint to follow. The abrupt cutoff added a layer of unease to an already tense investigation, signaling that the disappearance was no longer just a matter of misadventure. Friends and family began filling the gaps with speculation, each suggestion more anxious than the last. A rumor emerged of a possible drug deal gone wrong in the area, though police found no evidence to support it. Some whispered about an unknown stranger seen in the vicinity in the days prior, a figure reportedly lurking near the tree line, whose presence no one could fully verify. Others suggested the teenagers might have stumbled upon something they were not meant to see. The speculation fed into itself, each possibility darker than the last, leaving families oscillating between hope and dread. Parents argued among themselves, friends questioned each other, and investigators noted that fear and guilt were already beginning to color eyewitness accounts, making the truth even harder to discern. Environmental clues only added to the confusion. Soil samples collected from the drag marks indicated disturbed underbrush consistent with a human-sized object moving across uneven terrain. Leaves were torn, bark scraped, and small twigs broken, yet there were no signs of panic or struggle that would accompany a fall. Even the wildlife in the area seemed to have noticed the disturbance. Tracks of deer and raccoons veered sharply away from the same section of forest, as though instinctively avoiding the site. It was an anomaly, a a deviation from the natural order that set investigators on edge. Forensics could not explain why the teens' belongings were scattered in such a calculated manner, nor why nothing else had been disturbed or left behind. Every lead seemed to open another door to questions. A neighbor recalled seeing headlights parked near the edge of the forest that night, but could not identify the vehicle. A passing jogger reported hearing a muffled voice calling for help, though the direction and distance were impossible to confirm. Friends remembered seeing a shadow move between trees while they were focused on the bonfire, an observation they initially dismissed as imagination. Taken together, these fragments created a patchwork of uncertainty, each piece incomplete, yet collectively suggestive of something deliberate and unsettling. The psychological toll was immediate and visible. Families spent sleepless nights replaying events, imagining what could have happened, how it might have been prevented, and whether anyone else had been involved. Friends wrestled with survivor guilt, questioning every decision made that night. Why didn't we follow them? Why didn't we notice the stranger? Investigators, despite their experience, found themselves constrained by the absence of concrete evidence, aware that speculation could not replace proof, but also understanding that the uncertainty itself could corrode hope. As the days turned into weeks, it became increasingly clear that the mystery was only deepening. Each lead, cell phone data, eyewitness reports, environmental anomalies, was a piece of a puzzle that refused to fit together. There was no clear motive, no suspect, and no definitive sequence of events. The forest, once a familiar backdrop to weekend adventures, had become a silent and indifferent witness to the disappearance. For everyone involved, the line between accident and intent blurred, creating a slow-building psychological unease that refused to relent. Investigators doubled down on analysis, reviewing patterns in regional missing person cases and noting the rare but unsettling similarities to other disappearances, yet nothing concrete connected the dots. It was as though Mia and Jason had vanished from the physical world while leaving behind only whispers, a backpack, a sneaker, a blanket, and the faint trace of drag marks. And in the minds of those who loved them, the absence began to take a shape of its own, a presence defined not by evidence but by the haunting realization that the last moments of these teenagers were unknowable, their fate suspended in the cold, unbroken silence of the forest. The case, still young, had become a study in ambiguity. Every trail ended too soon. Every clue opened more questions than it answered, and every conversation added layers of fear, guilt, and doubt. The forest kept its secrets close, and the investigation, no matter how thorough, seemed to circle the same unresolved puzzle. By the time authorities called another press briefing, the public was already unsettled, aware that this disappearance was not just tragic, it was inexplicably sinister. And as the days stretched onward, one haunting question persisted for investigators, friends, and family alike. If nothing in the evidence made sense, then what exactly had happened to Mia and Jason that night? As news of Mia and Jason's disappearance spread, the quiet town of Willow Creek began to shift. Local media outlets picked up the story quickly, broadcasting repeated segments that combined the last known images of the teens with descriptions of the forest and lake where they vanished. Each report sparked a wave of concern, but also speculation. Neighbors came forward with accounts of vehicles parked near the shoreline at odd hours, strangers walking along the roads, and lights moving in the forest, none of which could be definitively verified. The details were fragmentary, contradictory, yet they fanned a growing sense of fear and unease. Parents described waking at odd hours to check on their children, scanning the tree line from bedroom windows, wondering if they had missed something critical, some subtle warning that could have prevented the disappearance. Social media amplified the uncertainty, creating a digital echo chamber of conjecture. Local Facebook groups and Twitter threads filled with theories, from the tragic to the sensational. Some suggested an accidental drowning, citing the cold water and darkness. Others leaned toward foul play, imagining a stranger exploiting the teens' isolation. Each post, each comment, added pressure on the small-town police force, already stretched thin by the scale of the search. Citizens demanded answers, calling town halls and writing letters, the tension manifesting as a mix of fear and frustration. In every household, the topic of conversation circled back to the same haunting question: what had really happened that night? The local sheriff, tasked with coordinating the investigation, found himself under growing scrutiny. Public statements emphasizing the meticulous nature of the search and the thorough documentation of evidence did little to quell frustration. Town meetings became tense, with parents and neighbors pressing for timelines, explanations, and visible progress. The scrutiny weighed on the department, and while officers continued to methodically examine the area, each day without a breakthrough intensified the sense that the forest had claimed the teens in a way no one could yet understand. Behind the professional demeanor of law enforcement, there was a quiet acknowledgement that the case was becoming something more than a missing persons investigation. It was a test of community trust, patience, and resilience. For the families, the public attention was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it kept the case alive, maintaining search resources and community awareness. On the other, it was exhausting, forcing parents to relive every detail for reporters, neighbors, and friends. Mothers spoke of pacing their kitchens at night, unable to sleep, while fathers sat in silence, replaying the last moments they had seen their children, haunted by what they couldn't control. Friends of the teens wrestled with guilt, questioning whether leaving the bonfire first or failing to follow the couple into the woods had contributed to their disappearance. Every retelling, every media clip reinforced the same painful reality, that Mia and Jason's absence was not just a local tragedy, but a persistent, inescapable presence in the lives of everyone connected to them. Even other teenagers felt the ripple effect. The forest, once a place for weekend walks and harmless adventures, became a site of anxiety. Students hesitated to linger near the lake after dark, sharing rumors and nervous laughter about unseen eyes in the woods. The collective imagination of the town filled in the gaps left by the lack of evidence, creating an atmosphere of unease that hung over classrooms, homes, and playgrounds alike. Adults and teenagers alike began noticing details they had ignored before: a rustling in the underbrush, a flashlight beam in the distance, a car idling near the lake at unusual hours. Each observation was colored by fear, by the knowledge that two young lives had disappeared without explanation. The cumulative effect of media, speculation, and public scrutiny transformed the investigation into something broader than law enforcement could manage alone. Neighbors began organizing informal search parties, volunteers returning night after night to the forested shoreline, hoping for a clue or a sign. Their efforts, though well-intentioned, sometimes interfered with official operations, creating tension between law enforcement and the community. Still, the shared worry and collective vigilance reflected the depth of the town's grief and fear. Families of missing children, friends, and strangers all invested emotionally, hoping that their attention might somehow tip the scales toward discovery, toward answers that remained elusive. Meanwhile, investigators continued combing through the evidence, aware that the human dimension of the case was as critical as the physical. They conducted interviews with anyone who had attended the bonfire, mapping relationships, habits, and movements. Every fragment of information, no matter how minor, was weighed for relevance. Yet, as they probed deeper, the lack of concrete leads began to wear on even the most experienced officers. The forest, quiet and unyielding, refused to yield its secrets. Each unanswered question seemed to echo louder as time passed, heightening the sense of collective anxiety and helplessness in the community. By the end of the first week, the story had become a fixture in local consciousness. Parents remained sleepless, friends carried the weight of survivor guilt, and teens avoided the lake and forest, fearful of encountering the unknown. The town had shifted, subtly but unmistakably, from a place of familiarity to a place shadowed by suspicion, grief, and obsession. For the investigators, the pressure was unrelenting. For the families, every phone call, every media report carried both hope and dread. And for the missing, the forest kept its silence. In that silence, the town, exhausted and vigilant, understood one unshakable truth. The disappearance of Mia and Jason was no longer a simple mystery. It had become a living, breathing question that would linger, shaping every conversation, every thought, and every moment of the community's life until the day, if ever, they were found. As the weeks turned into months, the initial surge of leads began to fade. Every tip, every supposed sighting, and every small piece of evidence seemed to dissolve under closer scrutiny. The forest remained unyielding, concealing whatever had taken Mia and Jason from the lakeshore. Investigators reviewed every scrap of information they had collected, retracing steps, analyzing timelines, and revisiting witness accounts. Autopsy theories were drawn up based on circumstantial evidence, exploring the possibility that the teens had wandered too far into the cold night and succumbed to hypothermia. But without bodies, nothing could be confirmed. The absence of physical remains turned what might have been a straightforward tragedy into an unsettling void, one that grew heavier with each passing day. Detectives combed regional records, looking for patterns among other missing teens, abandoned campsites, and unexplained fires in the surrounding counties. They hoped to find a connection, some thread tying multiple disappearances together, but nothing surfaced. Each case appeared isolated, unique, and equally perplexing. Every similar scenario that could have provided insight only reinforced the sense of randomness, the idea that Mia and Jason's disappearance might have been a one-off, a rare and terrifying anomaly. For investigators, the lack of correlation became a source of frustration and self-doubt, the knowledge that even their most exhaustive efforts could yield no answers, gnawing at their confidence. Interviews continued with friends and family, yet they often yielded only speculation and emotion. Parents described sleepless nights, haunted by the image of their children walking alone in the dark. Friends wrestled with survivor guilt, constantly replaying the last night in their minds, questioning whether a warning had been missed or a decision gone wrong. Investigators absorbed these accounts, aware that the emotional weight was as real as the physical evidence, yet increasingly aware that the human dimension offered no clarity about what had actually occurred. Every anecdote seemed to circle back to the same dead end. The teens' movements after leaving the fire remained a complete mystery. The physical evidence told its own frustrating story. The backpack, sneaker, and blanket were the only confirmed remnants of the teens' presence near the shore, and forensic analysis revealed nothing new. Drag marks in the dirt could not be conclusively linked to any suspect, and footprints in the area faded into indistinct impressions among the fallen leaves. Each potential lead that initially offered hope ultimately dissolved into ambiguity. Environmental clues that might have suggested direction or cause proved inconclusive. The forest seemed to reclaim its secrets, leaving law enforcement with nothing but questions that multiplied with every investigation. Private discussions among the investigative team reflected the growing tension. Experienced officers admitted privately that they could not rule out foul play, yet they could not identify a suspect, motive, or even a clear sequence of events. Frustration mounted as hours spent combing the area and reviewing reports yielded no breakthrough. The notion that Mia and Jason may never have left the forest alive began to permeate the conversations, an unspoken possibility that chilled even seasoned detectives. It was a scenario they could neither confirm nor dismiss, yet its plausibility weighed heavily on every subsequent decision and line of inquiry. Attempts to leverage modern technology, cell tower triangulation, digital forensics, and geospatial analysis produced timelines and coordinates, but no tangible connection to a location or individual. Every avenue that might have clarified their last moments seemed to evaporate under the scrutiny of reality. Investigators, methodical and meticulous, faced the excruciating truth. There were no answers waiting in the data, no definitive path forward, only the continuing absence of the teens themselves. Each day without discovery magnified the psychological strain, the sense of being trapped in a puzzle without a solution. The emotional toll on the families mirrored the professional frustration. Weeks became months, and every day without closure added to the weight of uncertainty. Parents vacillated between clinging to hope and preparing for the unthinkable. Friends, too, became prisoners of unanswered questions, haunted by what they had seen, what they had heard, and the inability to act. Within the investigative team, the haunting nature of the case began to influence strategy. Officers revisited old evidence multiple times, re-examined witness statements, and walked the shoreline again, hoping for something overlooked, anything that might crack open the silence. Even as formal investigation continued, unofficial theories circulated. Neighbors speculated about an unknown stranger or a sudden accident, a misstep into cold water, or even the intervention of someone with knowledge of the forest. But each conjecture, however plausible, collided with the lack of supporting evidence. There was no definitive proof to assign blame, to explain the sequence of events, or to recover the teens. The lack of closure fed a creeping dread that settled in both the hearts of the community and the minds of those charged with solving the case. By the end of the 6th month, the investigation had solidified into a state of unresolved tension. Every lead explored led to a dead end. Every theory remained unverified, and every unanswered question weighed heavier than the last. The silence of the forest pressed against investigators and families alike, a constant reminder that some mysteries resist solution. For law enforcement, the search became less about physical discovery and more about cataloging evidence, maintaining hope, and grappling with the possibility that the fate of Mia and Jason might never be known. In that unresolved space, frustration, grief, and dread merged, setting the stage for a new and unsettling chapter, one in which the absence itself became the haunting truth. 10 years had passed since Mia and Jason vanished from the lakeshore, a decade in which the town of Willow Creek carried their absence like a weight that never fully lifted. Families had aged, friends had moved on, and the forest had slowly reclaimed its dominance over the shoreline, leaving trails overgrown and footprints faded into memory. The case had gone cold, files stacked in police archives, evidence meticulously preserved but unsolved, a haunting question lingering in the minds of those who had waited, hoped, and grieved. Routine forest maintenance, however, would soon stir that dormant tension. A controlled burn had been conducted in a section of woods long untouched, clearing decades of undergrowth and leaving a thin layer of ash over the forest floor. What emerged from that routine work would shock both investigators and the families in equal measure. Amid the blackened ground and fallen leaves, a small glint caught the attention of one crew member. At first, it seemed incidental, just a scrap of metal or debris, but closer inspection revealed a small, weathered metal box, partially buried and coated in ash. Authorities were called immediately, and forensic teams arrived to secure the scene. What they found inside defied hope and terror in equal measure. A watch with Mia's initials etched delicately on the back, a bracelet that Jason had worn constantly, and a worn journal, its pages brittle but legible. The items were unmistakably theirs, verified through serial numbers, handwriting analysis, and familial confirmation. The discovery sent ripples through the town, rekindling a decade-old ache that had never fully subsided. For families, the find was both a relief and a torment. Seeing the tangible belongings of their missing children brought a sudden wave of reality crashing back into their lives. Parents wept openly, unable to reconcile the passage of 10 years with the discovery of these relics. Friends who had held on to hope felt it swell and constrict in equal measure, a reminder that their peers had existed, had lived, and had been taken. Yet the ultimate fate remained frustratingly unknown. The metal box became a focal point for renewed questions. Why had these items been left in this precise location, buried beneath ash? And what did it suggest about the last moments Mia and Jason had experienced? Investigators approached the discovery with a mix of caution and urgency. The items, while decades old, were remarkably well preserved, giving forensic teams an opportunity to analyze them for traces of contact, DNA, and environmental clues. Even small details, the type of wear on the bracelet, the scuffs on the watch face, the handwriting patterns in the journal, were scrutinized meticulously. Every finding was cross-referenced with the original investigation, generating both minor breakthroughs and new, frustrating ambiguities. The journal, in particular, contained cryptic notes and reflections from Mia, referencing someone she felt had been observing them, someone whose presence she did not understand. While the entries did not clarify the events of the night they disappeared, they did add a dimension of foreboding that had previously been only suspected. The discovery also reignited media attention and public scrutiny. Reporters descended on Willow Creek, recounting the original disappearance while displaying images of the recovered items. Social media chatter surged, theories multiplying in real time as viewers dissected photographs of the watch, bracelet, and journal pages. Rumors swirled about the significance of the controlled burn, the placement of the items, and whether someone had returned to the forest intentionally to leave them. For families, the renewed attention was both comforting and painful. The world suddenly remembered what they had been carrying quietly for a decade. Authorities reopened the case formally, examining not only the recovered items but the section of forest where they were found. Soil samples were taken, ash layers analyzed, and the surrounding terrain carefully mapped. Investigators considered whether the teens had been placed there at the time of their disappearance, or if the items had been moved in the years since. Each hypothesis brought with it a cascade of questions, and the absence of bodies meant that speculation remained anchored in uncertainty. Still, the tangible evidence offered a rare foothold in a case that had been otherwise defined by its voids. Psychologically, the impact on the community was profound. The forest, once a place of routine caution, became a locus of reflection and fear. Parents revisited their memories of the bonfire, recalling what had been seen and what had been dismissed. Friends wondered about the secrets the journal hinted at, questioning whether there had been warning signs they had ignored. Investigators, some now approaching retirement, felt a renewed urgency tempered by the decades of frustration that had accumulated. The mixture of hope and dread became palpable in every interview, every meeting, and every report filed. The item's discovery did not answer the central question: what ultimately happened to Mia and Jason? Yet it shifted the narrative, anchoring the decades-old mystery in something concrete. For families, the metal box represented a bittersweet connection, a proof of existence, a relic that affirmed what had been feared and suspected all along. It also confirmed that, whatever had occurred, it had taken place in a deliberate, calculated manner. Someone had ensured these items survived, while the teens themselves remained hidden from the world. As investigators documented the scene and collected every trace of evidence, the emotional weight of the find settled across the town. 10 years of silence had been punctuated by a single moment, a tangible echo of lives interrupted. And while the recovered items reignited hope that answers might someday emerge, they also deepened the unease. If the teens' belongings had survived, why had their bodies not? What unseen events had transpired in that forest to allow such a selective preservation? The questions were immediate, haunting, and impossible to ignore, setting the stage for a renewed investigation into the final hours of Mia and Jason, one that would confront the darkest possibilities and the limits of what could ever be known. Once the recovered items were transported to the forensic lab, investigators began a meticulous examination that would reveal unsettling new dimensions to Mia and Jason's disappearance. The watch and bracelet, though largely intact, were carefully scrutinized for fingerprints, DNA, and wear patterns. Even in their aged condition, they told a story of use and intimacy, but no foreign prints were found beyond the teens. It was the journal, however, that immediately drew attention. Its brittle pages contained entries that, on first glance, seemed ordinary. Notes about school, plans with friends, casual reflections on the forest. But upon closer inspection, cryptic passages hinted at something darker, references to a person who had been watching them, observations of strangers loitering near the shoreline, and mentions of secret meetings in secluded locations. Some entries contained lines like, "I don't know who I can trust," and "he's always there, waiting," which investigators interpreted as indications of fear and escalating tension in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. Forensic analysts turned their attention to the journal's composition. Ink composition tests revealed no tampering, confirming the entries were contemporaneous with the time of disappearance. Handwriting analysis matched Mia's known samples, and microscopic fibers embedded in the pages corresponded to the blanket found near the shore, tying the physical artifacts together in a single narrative. Every detail suggested the teens were aware of being observed, yet powerless to act, a realization that reframed the original investigation from a probable misadventure to a case with an apparent element of deliberate interference. Chemical analysis of the blanket and soil surrounding the items uncovered traces of accelerants consistent with a controlled burn, but not the type typically used in forest maintenance. The accelerant patterns suggested the items had been intentionally burned elsewhere, then transported to the location where they were eventually found. Further microscopic soil particle analysis revealed soil types inconsistent with the immediate area of the lakeshore, pointing toward an unknown secondary location, possibly several miles from the original bonfire site. This discovery shifted the investigation sharply. Mia and Jason might not have disappeared at the shoreline itself, but had been moved, raising the specter of kidnapping or foul play. The implications were chilling. The teens' last hours had likely involved human intervention rather than misadventure, a reality long suspected but never proven. Investigators re-examined the journal for additional context. Passages detailing routine walks near the forest and mentions of encountering unfamiliar vehicles or people suddenly took on new significance. The notes about meetings appeared deliberately vague, perhaps intentionally coded to avoid detection if read by anyone other than the intended audience, likely Jason or Mia themselves. Experts in behavioral analysis suggested the entries reflected acute stress and hypervigilance, psychological indicators that the teens were increasingly aware of a potential threat. The combination of tangible items, accelerant residue, and coded journal entries pointed toward a scenario that law enforcement had only speculated about in whispers, that the disappearance was not accidental, but orchestrated. The forensic revelations also prompted a re-examination of the original drag marks near the lakeshore. Investigators speculated that these might not have been from an accidental fall, but were consistent with moving objects of human size. Combined with the evidence that the items were burned elsewhere, the theory emerged that Mia and Jason had been forcibly relocated and that the belongings had been deliberately deposited to create a false narrative of abandonment. This perspective reframed every prior clue, from distant flashlight sightings to unverified voices in the forest, as potentially tied to an unseen human actor with knowledge of the teens' movements. The families were briefed carefully, and the emotional impact was profound. The confirmation that Mia and Jason may have been in the presence of another person during their final hours elicited a combination of shock, grief, and renewed dread. For parents who had long struggled with the uncertainty of a missing persons case, the possibility of foul play was both terrifying and tragically validating. They had feared as much all along, but now it had tangible forensic backing. Friends, too, experienced a surge of anxiety, wondering if casual encounters from the past had been more sinister than they had realized. The discovery also intensified public interest. Media coverage shifted, emphasizing the forensic evidence and introducing theories of kidnapping or intentional misdirection. Social media discussions expanded beyond speculation about the forest to debates over who might have had access to the teens and whether the evidence suggested a single perpetrator or a more complex scenario. Each article, interview, and post served as a reminder that the case was far from resolved and that the forest of Willow Creek, once merely a backdrop, now loomed as a site of deliberate and disturbing human activity. Investigators, emboldened by the forensic findings, planned a renewed series of interviews and searches of nearby properties, hoping to identify potential witnesses or patterns that had previously gone unnoticed. Every aspect of the case, from the burned items to the coded journal entries, suggested that the disappearance had been premeditated, calculated, and meticulously executed. The cold case, once defined by its silence, now pulsed with tangible evidence of human involvement, creating a chilling context in which every prior assumption had to be reconsidered. As the forensic team compiled their final reports, one conclusion became unavoidable. Mia and Jason had likely been in another location before the items were burned, and they had been aware of a looming, unseen threat in the weeks preceding their disappearance. The combination of accelerants, soil evidence, and journal entries transformed a decade-old mystery into a case with an increasingly dark and specific narrative. And in the minds of investigators and families alike, the haunting question remained. If someone had been watching, following, and ultimately orchestrating events, then who had the means and the knowledge to carry it out? And could the truth about the teens' fate ever truly be uncovered? With the recovered items and forensic revelations in hand, investigators began an exhaustive reconstruction of Mia and Jason's final night. Every known detail was cataloged: timelines of the bonfire, witness statements, cell phone pings, and even minor observations from friends who had been present. Digital forensics revealed the teens' devices had remained active in the forest until approximately 11:45 p.m., but signal traces were fragmented, suggesting movement and interference consistent with being taken from the shoreline. Detectives combined this information with environmental analysis of the forest terrain, examining slopes, underbrush density, and pathways that might explain how someone could have discreetly intercepted the teens. The process was painstaking, requiring a convergence of technology, experience, and intuition, but it began to illuminate a sequence of events that had remained obscured for over a decade. Psychological profiling played a key role in shaping the narrative of those final hours. Experts noted that Mia's journal entries suggested a growing awareness of surveillance, and behavioral analysis indicated that she may have confronted the observer at some point during the night. Her actions, though courageous, may have escalated the danger, a dynamic compounded by Jason's protective instincts. Profilers suggested that the couple's behavior, the decision to leave the bonfire, traverse the shoreline, and eventually move into the forest, was consistent with an attempt to evade someone they believed was following them. Witness testimony of distant voices and faint movements in the trees corroborated this sense of pursuit, creating a chilling picture of teenagers aware of a threat they could not fully comprehend. Environmental evidence supported the theory that Mia and Jason had been moved from the lakeshore. Soil analysis of the location where their belongings were burned revealed particles inconsistent with the immediate shoreline, implying transportation over distance. Microfiber analysis on the blanket and clothing further suggested handling beyond natural movement, reinforcing the possibility of human intervention. Investigators also reviewed subtle anomalies in the drag marks previously recorded, aligning their measurements with the theory that objects, and potentially the teens themselves, had been shifted with care and deliberate intent. The forest, once an anonymous backdrop, emerged as a stage for calculated actions executed under the cover of darkness. Witness accounts were revisited with this framework in mind. Several friends recalled faint sounds of shouting or branches snapping in ways inconsistent with ordinary activity. One neighbor remembered hearing a car engine idle briefly near the edge of the forest around the same time the teens disappeared. While each observation was minor on its own, when combined with the forensic evidence and psychological profile, a pattern emerged. Someone nearby had likely exploited the teens' isolation, tracking their movements and ultimately manipulating the sequence of events that led to their disappearance. Investigators noted that these were not random anomalies, but deliberate opportunities seized under the cover of night. Digital reconstruction techniques allowed law enforcement to create a rough timeline, plotting probable movements based on cell signal loss, witness observations, and terrain analysis. Investigators theorized that the teens left the bonfire around 10:45 p.m., following a path along the lake where initial footprints ended abruptly. From there, signals suggested movement deeper into the forest, followed by disappearance from cell tower coverage. The convergence of data pointed to a secondary location, a concealed spot, likely chosen for its remoteness and ease of access by someone familiar with the forest. It was in this location, investigators concluded, that the teens were likely confronted, restrained, or otherwise manipulated, their isolation exploited in a way that rendered them invisible to casual observers. Interviews with experts in criminal behavior underscored the calculated nature of such scenarios. Profilers emphasized that perpetrators of this type of abduction often study patterns of movement, exploit predictable routines, and select locations that reduce risk of detection. The combination of proximity, knowledge of the terrain, and awareness of the teens' habits suggested a perpetrator who was neither impulsive nor random, but methodical. The forensic evidence, burned items transported from the lakeshore, accelerant residue, and soil inconsistencies supported this hypothesis, providing a tangible link between behavior and environment. The emotional impact on families intensified as this reconstructed timeline took shape. Parents were briefed on the likely sequence of events, forced to confront the possibility that Mia had bravely challenged a stranger while Jason tried to protect her. Friends, too, grappled with the terrifying notion that ordinary moments, walking along the shore, leaving the fire, trusting the night, had been monitored and exploited. The realization that someone had been nearby, waiting and watching, deepened grief with a chilling clarity. As the investigation synthesized forensic data, psychological insight, and eyewitness testimony, the narrative coalesced into a harrowing portrait of the teen's final hours. The timeline suggested a gradual, intentional escalation. The decision to leave the bonfire, the movement through the forest, the confrontation or observation by an unknown individual, and the eventual relocation of the items that would emerge only a decade later. While gaps remained and the ultimate fate of Mia and Jason could not be confirmed, the reconstructed sequence offered the first coherent understanding of their ordeal. The reconstruction left investigators and families alike with a single unrelenting conclusion. Someone had been close enough to observe, manipulate, and ultimately control the teen's final movements. Every detail, from journal entries to burned artifacts, reinforced the disturbing possibility that the disappearance was not random, but deliberate. And as law enforcement prepared for renewed investigation and potential breakthroughs, the town of Willow Creek was forced to confront a chilling truth that had long lurked beneath the surface, that within the familiar forest and the seemingly mundane night, Mia and Jason had encountered a darkness that had been patiently waiting. Following the forensic revelations and reconstructed timeline, investigators revisited every lead with renewed intensity, sifting through the mountains of old reports, witness statements, and evidence files. Eyewitness accounts that had once seemed trivial were examined under a new lens. The neighbor who reported headlights, the jogger who claimed to hear a muffled voice, and even the friends who recalled shadows moving through the forest. Each observation was cross-referenced with new data from the forensic analysis, digital reconstructions, and psychological profiling, attempting to uncover patterns that might point toward the identity of the person who had been observing Mia and Jason. Every minor detail, once dismissed as anecdotal, now carried potential significance, yet the line between coincidence and critical information remained frustratingly blurred. Simultaneously, investigators combed through previously overlooked criminal records in the area, focusing on individuals with histories of stalking, assault, or abduction. One name began to stand out, a local with ties to small-time drug operations and a record of trespassing in forested areas near the lake. He had lived within a few miles of the bonfire site at the time of the disappearance and had been documented in multiple complaints filed by neighbors about suspicious activity. Officers scrutinized his movements, examined his known associates, and cross-checked timelines against the disappearance. While circumstantial connections emerged, nothing definitively placed him in the forest with the teens that night. His prior record painted a concerning picture, but the evidence was insufficient to pursue charges or to confirm involvement, leaving investigators with a tantalizing but ultimately inconclusive lead. Procedural realism guided the investigation at every step. Detectives conducted interviews, collected alibis, and submitted items for reanalysis, documenting each detail meticulously. The process was slow and methodical, reflecting the reality of a case that had grown cold over a decade. There were no dramatic arrests, no confessions, no explosive breakthroughs. Instead, investigators worked quietly, mapping out known facts, tracking potential connections, and ensuring that every lead, no matter how tenuous, was preserved in official records. Each new piece of information was weighed against existing evidence, but the gaps remained, leaving the full sequence of events incomplete and the ultimate fate of Mia and Jason unresolved. The community watched closely, aware that police were pursuing leads even as answers remained elusive. Families experienced a complex mixture of hope and frustration, hope that renewed investigation might bring closure, frustration that years of effort could still produce only partial insight. The local sheriff emphasized the careful procedural nature of the work, stressing that speculation and circumstantial links could not be used to fill the void left by missing evidence. This approach, while necessary, was emotionally taxing for those who had long waited for answers, reminding them that the system's methodical pace often conflicts with the urgency of grief. Re-examined witness reports highlighted inconsistencies as well as potential insights. Some details that had once seemed contradictory gained plausibility under the forensic and psychological framework. Shadows glimpsed in the trees, voices in the distance, and fleeting headlights now fit into a narrative suggesting that someone had followed, observed, and ultimately controlled the teen's final movements. Yet, without physical proof, these observations remain part of a mosaic of circumstantial evidence, compelling yet legally insufficient. Investigators knew they had to tread carefully, balancing the emotional weight of renewed attention with the legal standards required for prosecution. Despite the absence of concrete results, the process itself yielded incremental insights. Investigators refined timelines, narrowed possible locations where the teens had been held or moved, and clarified the significance of the recovered items. They began to understand the case not as a single event, but as a series of actions, some deliberate, some opportunistic, carried out in a manner designed to avoid detection. Each discovery added layers of understanding, yet simultaneously emphasized the limits of certainty in the absence of the victims themselves. For families, the emergence of a suspect brought a difficult reality into focus. The possibility that someone with prior criminal behavior might have been involved intensified grief rather than alleviating it. Parents struggled with the realization that even with a named individual, justice might never be achieved, and that much of what had happened remained obscured. Friends shared in the burden, haunted by the idea that their peers' disappearance had been observed and manipulated, yet the full truth would likely never be known. The human cost, psychological trauma, unresolved fear, and a lingering sense of vulnerability was as real as any physical evidence could convey. Investigators documented every action meticulously, aware that future breakthroughs might depend on maintaining a clear, comprehensive record. The files became a detailed map of what was known, what was suspected, and what remained unknown. Each page emphasized the limitations of the investigation while also preserving the possibility that the case could one day yield answers. The tension between procedural rigor and human desire for resolution defined every step, reinforcing the cold, methodical reality of long-term investigations. As the case remained officially open, the narrative emphasized the haunting nature of unresolved mysteries. The suspect, though linked circumstantially, could not be charged. Witnesses recalled what they saw and heard, but none could provide the decisive piece of evidence needed to reconstruct the final moments of Mia and Jason. The town, investigators, and families were left to grapple with a sobering reality. Sometimes, even with compelling clues and emerging leads, the full truth remains beyond reach. And as the files were filed, evidence stored, and the investigation continued cautiously, the haunting question endured, lingering over the community and the memory of the teens, a reminder that not all mysteries yield their answers, and that absence can be as telling and as devastating as any discovery. The ashes, now carefully collected and analyzed, were all that remained of the physical trail left by Mia and Jason. Alongside the watch, bracelet, and journal, they were fragments of lives interrupted, tangible reminders of a night that had long since slipped from memory into myth. Forensic experts examined the remains meticulously, confirming that the burn patterns and microscopic soil evidence aligned with previous findings, reinforcing the chilling theory that the teens had been moved, contained, or manipulated before their belongings were left behind. Yet, despite every scientific tool at investigators' disposal, the precise sequence of events, the moment they were confronted, the decisions they made, the final choices that led to their disappearance, remained impossible to determine. Each ash particle was a witness that could not speak, each burned page a story only partially told. Experts in survival psychology and environmental hazards weighed in on what might have transpired. They noted the challenges of navigating dense forest terrain at night, the potential for exposure to hypothermia, and the physiological stress of prolonged fear. Behavioral analysts highlighted the human factors, the instinct to flee, the protective drive between Jason and Mia, and the potential miscalculations when confronted with a predator who had observed them. All these factors created scenarios that were plausible but unverifiable, emphasizing how vulnerability and circumstance could intertwine in the absence of witness testimony. Yet each theory, however detailed, could only point to possibilities, never providing closure. The families, having endured 10 years of uncertainty, faced the bittersweet task of memorializing their children. Ceremonies were held near the lakeshore, the forest, and the site of the controlled burn, spaces that had defined the teens' last known movements. Friends and neighbors gathered, sharing recollections, reading passages from the journal, and holding quiet moments of remembrance. The metal box and its contents were placed in safekeeping, a symbolic anchor connecting memory to reality. In these rituals, grief coexisted with an unspoken acceptance that Mia and Jason's story would remain incomplete, their voices lingering in the spaces they had once inhabited and in the shadows of the forest that had claimed them. Investigators closed the formal phase of the case with thorough documentation, preserving every detail for potential future breakthroughs while acknowledging the limits of what could ever be known. Reports highlighted the circumstantial evidence of foul play, the transport of belongings, and the psychological insights from the journal, yet each conclusion was tempered by uncertainty. No definitive sequence of events could be reconstructed, no suspect definitively linked, no body recovered. The case remained, in every practical sense, unresolved. The town of Willow Creek absorbed this final chapter with a quiet tension. The mystery lingered in everyday conversations, in the forest paths parents cautioned their children to avoid, and in the faint memory of a night when 2 teenagers vanished. The absence of resolution amplified the emotional weight of the discovery. 10 years of waiting, investigation, and grief culminated in confirmation that Mia and Jason had existed, had been observed, and had left behind traces of their presence, but not the answers anyone had hoped for. Their story closed on a note of haunting ambiguity, a reminder that some truths lie beyond reach. In the ashes, investigators saw evidence. In the journal, they saw the last thoughts of a frightened teenager. In the forest, the community felt the echo of lives taken too soon. And as families placed flowers, held each other, and remembered the laughter that had once filled the lakefront air, the reality settled in. Mia and Jason's voices remained, carried through the trees, whispered in the rustling leaves, a haunting testament to absence, to time, and to the enduring enigma of a night that would never be fully explained.